A very good afternoon to all our viewers. I hope you all are doing well. Welcome to a brand new episode in the Master Series sessions with our experts today. Today's topic and today's guests are very, very important for us. We are here with So, artificial intelligence is causing a paradigm shift in healthcare, powered by, of course, increasing access to a multitude of healthcare data and the rapid advent of analytical techniques. Popular AI techniques include machine learning, algorithms, neural networks, deep learning, natural language processing, etc. So, integrating AI based systems in healthcare can augment clinicians' efforts to care for patients. So we are here with our two extremely important and speakers with us here today. Please welcome Dr. Arvind Singh. A little about our speaker here. Dr. Arvind Singh has over 35 years of extensive experience in ophthalmology and is involved in the delivery of healthcare worldwide and re-engineering of clinical processes. He specializes in device safety and investigation of failed and malfunctioning medical devices and has board level experience as the strategy lead for the International Council of Ophthalmology Examinations. He's also helped several pharmaceutical companies present their discovery to the regulatory body for approval. Dr. Singh is very passionate about educating and training and has served as a senior examiner to the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Glasgow and the International Council of Ophthalmology as well. He's helped several healthcare startups in the market penetration, monetization of their products, processes, etc. His research includes including using, a big data and machine learning to improve medical care and AI algorithms for the early detection of diabetic retinopathy and cervical cancer. Absolute pleasure to have you with us here, sir. We also have Ms. Laina Emmanuel with over 14 years of experience in technology, international development, and business. Her interest lies in building systems for driving change through policy, business, and technology. She's the founder of the company focused on AI and 3D visualization based solutions for the diagnosis and prognosis of neuropsychiatric disorders. As an independent consultant, she's worked on various health and education policies issues as well. She's pursued an MBA from the Indian School of Business and attended MIT Entrepreneurship Boot Camp as well. She's currently the co-founder and CEO at Brainside. So welcome, Ms. Laina, to you as well. And over to Mr. Singh to start off and put context to today's session. So,
Thank you, Darshika. There are two people I'd like to start by thanking. One, Darshika Shah of Doc Plexus, who has politely and persistently chased Laina and me to get the thing right. And that's why we are here today. And my colleague, Laina Emmanuel, about whom and from whom you'll hear later. And these are people I feel privileged to call my friends, and I love the association with them. Coming to AI in healthcare, let's start with a little story about natural intelligence. I'm sure a lot of you have read about the visit of Yashi Dodin, the principal physician to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He was visiting Stanford, and as an authority on Tibetan medicine, they decided to test his expertise. They had a patient lying in a room. I'm told the story occurred in Stanford, and it could be one of the other American universities. And he was asked to diagnose what she had. He walked into the room, he held her hand, felt her pulse, hovered over her, described as an angel in white, and he asked for a urine sample. He then, with two chopsticks, whipped up the urine sample, smelt it, and put it away. When he made the diagnosis, when everybody was assembled in the conference hall, he said, waters from the right and left of the heart are mixing, but at a higher level, not lower. And much to everybody's astonishment, the chief physician opened the envelope with the diagnosis and said atrial septal defect. Now, we have absolutely no idea how he was able to diagnose atrial septal defect because of all the heart diseases, congenital heart diseases, the one with the least symptoms and signs is an ASD. Nevertheless, there was something in his knowledge, in the wisdom of ancient Tibetan medicine, and his experience that allowed him to make the diagnosis. Exactly what people think about the black boxes that run our artificial intelligence algorithms. However, because of this fear, we are much more aware of what the algorithms do. And when we build them in such a way that that can be easily looked at. And the processes that we put into it can be examined. And that increases the confidence level of the device. Now, what is AI in healthcare used for? It can be used for a whole range of things: end-to-end drug design, ophthalmology, cardiology, interpreting brain images, something that Laina will talk about later, and a whole range of conditions. But why is it superior to human intelligence? Let us first look at saying what we consider a natural intelligence before we move on to an understanding of artificial intelligence. I'll give example from ophthalmology because that is quite familiar to me. When you devise a system in a human being first, we can look into the retina. And what we teach our trainees is to look at certain features, three features mainly: the optic disc, the macula, and the rest of the retina with anything unusual, like the blood vessels, microaneurysms, hemorrhages, or what used to be called soft exudates, but we now know are actually microinfarcts, where the blood doesn't reach, and therefore the transparent retina becomes opaque at that spot. Now, it is very easy to replicate an ophthalmoscope and to have a device. I've got one here, which costs about $20. And it does the same job that several 100-pound ophthalmoscope can do. It has a light, it has a whole lot of scales here, it allows you to measure various things. But when you use a device like this, it assumes that in the head of the examiner, processing exists to interpret the image that is being shown. So if we want to widen the use of clinical expertise, devices play a very small role. And that is the reason it still depends on a physician to actually look through the whole and give an interpretation. And that is where AI comes in. With the help of AI algorithms, we can interpret the images such that the actual imaging can be operated by somebody who's not a trained doctor, but is a mere technician. So there are two aspects to the implementation of AI in imaging, such as the retina. We have a source of imaging like the camera. Then we have a system to identify what the image is and take it to the next level, where we try and replicate what a person is seeing. When we started out on the diabetic project to do diabetic screening, as you know, the diabetics, depending on the duration and control of diabetes, develop complications, which can be renal failure. But to us, what concerns is blindness. And the best part is this blindness is preventable. So if we have a system which picks up the retinal findings, interprets it, analyzes it, and then makes a recommendation. Now, very often AI systems are advisory, and that is what makes them safe. But we saw the example of a system that could execute a change was when those of us who fly airplanes for a hobby know that when Airbus introduced its automated systems, they were all advisory. And even today, in an aircraft, if you're not preparing to land, but if the aircraft comes very close to the ground, you have a warning which says pull up, pull up, pull up. The aircraft does not change its flying characteristics, but merely advises the pilot to act. But the incident with Boeing 737 MAX showed that when you override the pilot or don't bring him into the loop, in this case, the doctor, then the consequences can be disastrous. They had designed a system by which if the aeroplane thought it was in a stall, and one of the most difficult things to manage is a stall where the aircraft stops flying and drops like a brick. That happens when you go slower than the minimum speed of the airplane, and that is the speed at which it can still fly. But once you go slower than that, then the aeroplane falls. And in Boeing 737 MAX, they had a system which said that if the aeroplane thought it was going to stall, then it will automatically take corrective action. And what you do when you come to a stall speed is you lower the nose, put maximum power, and accelerate out of the situation while regaining height once the stall has been avoided. So these Boeing aircraft, when they got the impression that they were going to stall, they lowered the nose and increased the power. The pilot tried to prevent it. In two cases, the pilot was unable to fight the aircraft and they crashed. One was in Ethiopia, the other is Malaysia. Fortunately, all or most of the artificial intelligence systems that we use in medicine are advisory rather than executional. They do not take an action, they advise you to take an action. So when we look at it, what is it that makes an AI system much better? When we look at the characteristics in a moment, but when you, on the face of it, if you look at a retina and try and see the things that are happening, every time you look at it, your experience increases. So when we make a diagnosis, it's based on the knowledge we have and our experience of seeing hundreds of eyes before. The advantage of an AI system is that you can multiply that by a number of factors because it does not have one person's experience. It's got a cumulative experience of hundreds of people. Knowledge base is also used to guide the rules that we define ourselves. So when we are devising an AI system in healthcare, we tell it what to do, and the pathways are worked out by us. It's just that the machine does it much more efficiently and in a much shorter period of time. And when we did our diabetic screening program, we had three AI experts with tremendous expertise in computing. They were doing chip design, they were fabricating chips. These guys knew what they were talking about, certainly 100 times more than I do about these things. And then they got together, they sat around the table. It happened at the peak of pandemic. And two of us, a professor of pathology from St. John's Medical College and myself, and a friend of mine who's a medical retina expert, we went through picture by picture, explaining to these AI people exactly what we were looking for. One of the difficulties in having worked at the clinical IT interface now for 18 or 20 years, I find the problem starts with the doctor. A doctor is unable to articulate what his needs are and what he wants to see. So very often the IT person is trying to solve the problem they think the doctors have. And in the end up finding a solution for a problem that has nothing to do with medicine that originally brought us to the table. So in this case, we went picture by picture. We pointed out to the AI expert that when we look at the disc, we see the characteristics of the disc. But the life in the retina centers around the macula. That's the part that we use for seeing, driving, reading, and everything important. Anything happening close to the macula is much more significant. So in talking to these IT people in their language, we pointed out what are the changes of the retina. For example, the microaneurysms, hemorrhages, exudates. But more important was their location. An exudate far out in the periphery or a hemorrhage far out in the periphery doesn't concern us as much as a hemorrhage near the macula. These IT experts guided us into attaching a value to each location. A macular hemorrhage close to the macula or a leakage close to the macula had a much higher weightage than hemorrhage out in the periphery. And therefore, discussing with us the various clinical parameters, they were able to devise algorithms that reflected the value that we attach in these things. And also allowed us to think laterally. For example, a hemorrhage at the disc is statistically associated with glaucoma, where the pressure in the eye is quite high. We did not want that to be mistaken as a diabetic hemorrhage. And we provided them with all the necessary input clinically. And the agreement was that we talked about medicine and they talked about IT. We didn't tell them how to do IT, and they didn't tell us how to do eye surgery. So with this in mind, we set out the goals of our IT colleagues devising algorithms that could process the images faster than we could with a human brain and with a much greater depth of experience that lay behind what was going on. What are the concerns when we use these systems? The concern is we have three main concerns. First is the accuracy of our diagnosis, which determines your course of action, whether patients will be followed up 2 years, 1 year, or shorter period of time. Secondly, what are our false positives? And what is the rate of false negative? A false positive is not a bad thing. All it means is you bring in extra resources. In other words, if the computer or your IT system thinks there is skin cancer or cervical cancer, but actually there is no cancer, or if the AI system thinks the diagnosis of diabetes shows the diabetes more advanced than it is, all you need to do, bring in another level of expertise. In other words, these complicated cases can then be referred to either a physician or a specialist diabetologist to take things further. The first instance, we use these people to look at the pictures. So their time is only spent on situations where the picture alone doesn't give them enough information. What is a false negative? A false negative is when the device tells you the patient does not have cancer, but actually does have cancer, or does not have diabetic retinopathy severe enough to require an intervention, but the patient does. So in case of a diabetic or somebody with an eye problem, if you declare them negative, they will go and they may well go blind before it's picked up. Or in cervical cancer, the cancer will continue advancing. So one of the things that one has to focus on in developing a system, AI-based system, is to make sure that our false negatives are reduced to zero in an ideal world. But very often, we introduce the same element of skepticism that we do for false positives. So if the computer, there is a disparity between the image seen and the computer's recommendation, we get that also looked at by a clinician or a trained observer. And that brings us to the conclusion that this one was wrong. So when we look at AI systems in diabetic retinopathy and the way we have developed it, we sat around a table with 3 or 4 AI experts, professor of pathology, and 2 retina experts. And we went through picture by picture. In each photograph, we went through the features that I would feel concerned, or my colleague, the medical retina expert, will feel concerned. And what were the features that the AI people could get them to their process to identify. And after going through 100 pictures, we let them devise the algorithms. They were in telephone contact. Once in a while, we get a phone call saying, in this particular picture, the distance of the aneurysm from the macula is X. Is that what significance do you attach to that? So they were actually in real time doing what we would be doing in our direct observation, except that once they put it into the algorithm, it would do it in fraction of the time. So once we had done this and they had done their algorithms, we gave them another 100 photographs and asked them to use their system to diagnose, interpret, classify, and stage those diabetics. And they did that. Once we had done it about 3 times, we found that contrary to published data from one of the big IT companies in the world, where algorithms, when they were implemented, were found to be 55% accurate, we found that our algorithms were 90% accurate. In other words, an image that we acquired, there was still 10% of those images which needed to be looked at. But with regards to resource implication, those 10% would be looked, the images will be looked by the clinician first. And looking at the actual patient would come much later and would be in a much smaller number. So when we were devising our implementation, we found that we reduced the false negative to near zero. We got our diagnosis very accurate. And also the image was interpreted with a recommendation. We built an additional element as to which diabetics needed to go for treatment, which of the diabetics could be followed up in 2 years, which could be followed up in a year, or which of them we felt another look was necessary in a few months' time so that we could arrive at a much safer management practice. What benefits do we have for a system like this? It reduces the number of people required. It brings the cost down because as we know, not so much in the UK, but in the US, certainly the most expensive part of the chain is the ophthalmologist. If he's going to spend time looking at your algorithm or your patient instead of driving his Porsche around, it costs us a lot of money to get him to do that. Whereas if we reduce the number of trained clinicians required to do it, we shorten the pathway. We also make the decision more speedy, and there are lower resource implications. So our objective in devising this AI system was to make sure that diabetics can be screened regularly, can be followed up without human resource implications, and thereby we would make our contribution of saving the diabetics from going blind. The objective was, and the reason we devised the system from scratch is because there have been a lot of people who have attached lenses to smartphones to photograph the retina. That is a very good solution, but it's a very high price point solution. 80% of what's in the smartphone is not required, and 20% that is required, we can recreate in a much lower price point. So the system we have devised has got, because our patent is still pending, there's a limited amount of detail that can be discussed here, is a specialized camera which picks up the image of the retina, transfers it to the cloud, and is then analyzed by AI algorithms. We expect our device to be used for screening for skin cancer, for cervical cancer. 90,000 women, I'm told, in India die of cervical cancer. So there we are saving lives. And also our systems will be advisory, work in conjunction with the clinicians managing patients, but often in their absence. So where do we see the future of AI? Now that we understand that what AI can do for us and how AI works, the future can be in a whole range of conditions. In ophthalmology, it's screening for cancer. We have AI systems being used in diagnosis of cardiac disease. And as Laina will later on tell us, is imaging or analyzing the imaging of via the medium of functional MRI. So I see a great future in AI and machine learning algorithms being used for delivery of healthcare. They are a system that saves us human resources, allows it to be fine-tuned to exactly the situation we are adjusting. The equipment can be the same, but the algorithms can change. We can use an imaging device for different modalities and use the AI algorithms which are customized to pick up things in that particular domain. I think I've said enough about the background and interest in AI in healthcare. If I was to talk any more, some of you will be doing retinal screening and the rest of you will be doing AI algorithm writing, and all of us will be out of a job. But I will now hand over to Laina, who, unlike me, has done more than just talking about AI. She has set up a startup to apply AI algorithms to images. And along with Darshika is the other person who was involved in this session. So over to you, Laina.
Thank you so much, Dr. Arvind. As usual, it's such a pleasure to hear you. And a very good morning and good afternoon to everybody across time zones today. Let me also thank Darshika. Thank you so much for inviting me here. As I said, I've always been very excited to hear Dr. Arvind, so I jumped on this chance to be able to present with him. So let me start with sharing my screen. Darshika, please let me know if you're able to see it.
Sure.
Are you able to see my screen?
Yeah, beautiful and clear.
Great.
Yes.
So great. Now, as Dr. Arvind said, the ability of AI-related techniques like machine learning, deep learning, these are all things that you might have heard. And the ability of these techniques to transform raw data into valuable knowledge that can guide the doctor is growing at a very breakneck speed. And it's probably feeling too much, too fast for a lot of us. So not just doctors, but also people like me who've been in the AI field. I think one of the constant questions we ask each other in the team is, how do we keep up with the wealth of knowledge that is being created in the AI field right now? So in fact, one field that today has been touched by the magic of AI has been neuroscience. And what I'm going to talk about is how our company, Brainsight AI, is using all of these advances in AI in neuroimaging and high performance computing, and how we are using it to, how we're bringing it all together to democratize its access to doctors. My name is Laina Emmanuel, and I'm the founder CEO of Brainsight AI. But before I talk about what our company does, let me talk a little bit about myself and my journey. I come from a family of doctors. My elder sister is an ENT surgeon, and like all younger siblings, I idolized her. And when she went off to medical school, I wanted to go to medical school as well. But having seen all the hard work that she put into her medical school, my parents decided that at least the younger child should have something easier in life. And that's when they said that, okay, possibly I was good at maths, and hence that's how I ended up. A large part of my career was spent in engineering and in the high performance computing field. Over the first 5 to 7 years of my career, I was coding operating systems at NetApp and the Offshore Development Center of Cisco. But I really wanted to, I think that doctor envy was always there, and I really wanted to use my skills in a much more impactful, much more exciting field. And that's when I made a switch to public health, and I worked with the ministry at various levels, working on public health issues. I also completed my MBA from ISB in healthcare. And then I started this company, Brainsight, 3 years back with Dr. Rimshim Agarwal. Dr. Rimshim did her PhD from NIMHANS, where she was looking at how advanced neuroimaging and the power of machine learning on this can be used for the diagnosis, management, and rehabilitation of neuropsychiatric disorders. Over the course of her PhD, she read a lot of papers. She experimented with various data sets, be it neurogenetics, be it neuroimaging, be it neurotransmitters, all of these various different data sets, various different techniques. Within AI, there was deep learning, there was feature-based learning. There were so many different AI techniques itself and statistical techniques. And various paradigms. So the area of brain science is such a highly evolving field. So in her PhD, she experimented with a lot of different ways of looking at the brain. And today, she has published a number of papers in this field. And so have, ever since then, we also have published quite a number of papers as Brainsight as well. Now, her field of knowledge, as I said, kind of went across these various different things, across AI, across neuroimaging, etc. And today, our repository of knowledge at Brainsight is enhanced by 4 different fields. One is that of advanced neuroimaging, like resting state Fmri, as Dr. Arvind pointed out, 3D simulation, machine learning, and high performance computing. And we have various publications in place, and there are a number of different publications that we are already producing, and we hope to kind of present next year at some of these conferences. And the thing is, that is a problem, right? Like, the fact is, a lot of the field is exploding, and we are all reading papers. We are all trying to make sense of this big area. And where we ourselves as a team have so many problems keeping up with the research, building new evidence, creating that evidence, publishing that evidence, disseminating that evidence. I don't think doctors who have such busy lives can go through these hundreds of papers to figure out how they can use AI in their daily practice. So what I do believe is that what is stopping AI from being put to productive use today in thousands of different clinical situations is not some new learning algorithm. It's not the need for more programmers fluent in the mathematics of the new stochastic gradient descent or any of the backpropagation, anything, you name it. It's not even the need for new accessible software libraries. What I do believe is that for doctors like you to use AI, we need to build interfaces that put the power of these systems back in your hands. And with this, what I'm going to, I'll talk about an example from history. So when Microsoft Excel, or in fact, even before that, Lotus, if you remember, when those packages came out, right, it completely revolutionized the field of personal computing. It wasn't that before that these kind of technologies were not available. So, and it wasn't the fact that these cutting edge math or programming techniques came out suddenly, or a killer app came out suddenly for personal computing for the world to adopt this kind of work. It was a very simple insight by this gentleman called Dan Bricklin, who kind of made this connection between the possibilities of programming and the working methods of real people. And he produced the first electronic spreadsheet. As you can see his quote, it's really cool. I thought if only I had a blackboard where I could erase a number and write a new number in, and everything would recalculate. And that's what you need for doctors today. You've got all of this big AI learning algorithms. What you don't have are very good interfaces that can help you play around with the data, that can help you work with it intuitively in the way that you would like to, and which makes most sense for you. And that's where we decided that we need to kind of build a software like that. And that's why we are building VoxelBox. What VoxelBox essentially does is it allows radiologists and neurosurgeons and neurologists who want a peek into the functional activity of the brain of a patient. All they need to do, like Excel, is just do very simple steps. They just have to upload an MRI, and they get all of this really complicated processing done for them in a matter of seconds, and they get to see the output in ways like this. They can then play around it. They want to see the visual network, they want to see the auditory network, they want to see the cognitive network of the patient. They can do all of that. They just have to click and point, and everything's available for them. And the AI in the background kind of recomputes for them every single time. That's what we are building today. It's like the Microsoft Excel. The entry barrier is really slow. All you need to know is how to upload, and the rest of it is taken care of in the background. But as simple as it looks, it's actually a very, very complicated piece of software. So I'll talk about that. But before that, let me also talk about, so here's Microsoft Excel. Now you can apply it to various different situations. So there are doctors who ask us for, can we look at the functional MRI for better planning of surgeries for brain tumor patients? There are doctors who ask us, can we look at early dementia functional activity for patients? Or can we look at psychiatric disorder? Are there functional activity patterns that are very specific to psychiatric disorders? Can we use this for Parkinson's to figure out where exactly the ablation needs to happen? Can we use this for epilepsy to figure out where exactly the epileptic foci is? So there are all of these various different questions that doctors keep asking us. And because the tool is like Microsoft Excel, can enable a number of different use cases, all of them really think about, when we give it to them, it's a creative act really. So they really think about, okay, how can I use this better in my own practice? But this one specific problem that we've really worked on a lot is that of brain tumor. And let me talk about a little bit about what we are doing there. So neurosurgeons today, when they have to conduct surgery, and for a brain tumor patient or for an epilepsy patient, they really need to know the functional networks which are joining the area of the surgery. The current methods of doing it are two very difficult methods. One is called a task-based fMRI, where you're essentially asking the patient to go into a machine and do some tasks. So for example, if the doctor suspects that the area around the tumor is close to the language network, they will ask the patient to go into the MRI machine. They'll ask them to speak a paragraph, and they will map out the networks of the brain, just the language networks. They have a template, and they see whether the language network kind of maps with that template. That's one way of doing it. It's a very long method. Will you give? Sorry about that. So yeah, so what I was saying was, the method of task-based fMRI is a very difficult one because one, it's expensive, it's cumbersome. It doesn't apply to 40% of the patients because they're either cognitively challenged, they're either too old, or they're too young, or they are paralyzed or comatose and have come in for a traumatic brain surgery, whatever it might be. This technique doesn't work for a lot of the patients. So the other alternative that neurosurgeons today have is that of direct electrical stimulation during awake brain surgery. And all of you would know, so essentially what you're doing is you're placing these electrodes, and when the patient, and asking the patient to speak. When the electrodes are very close to the language network, the patient starts slurring, and so you know that that's the area that you don't need to touch. Both of these methods, as you can see, are either too expensive or cumbersome, or they're quite invasive. What we wanted to then think about is, there's one more problem with this whole thing. That is something that neuroscience has recently figured out. It's the fact that when you're doing a task, or when you're putting the electrode on the brain of the patient while you're asking them to speak, which is also a task essentially, only 5% of your brain's energy is really being used. 95% of your brain's energy is actually being expended in a thing called resting state networks. These are the networks when you're not really doing a task. These resting state networks, like your default mode network, your salience network, your attention network, all of these are networks which are working all of the time. And neither from a task-based fMRI nor from a direct electrical stimulation will you ever get any kind of information about these 95%. And these 95% of these networks are the ones which really make a patient who they are. So it's about how you pay attention. It's about how you make sense of different sensory inputs. All of these are things that you can't really find out through a task. And hence, a task-based fMRI gives very limited information for a doctor to make good decisions around surgery planning. And that's why we decided one of the problems that we want to solve through our Microsoft Excel of fMRI is there an easy way of accessing these functional networks by using machine learning on resting state, on DTI, etc. And that's what we are focusing on today. We've created VoxelBox. VoxelBox, doctors, radiologists can just upload these resting state functional MRIs, which take just 5 to 7 minutes, as opposed to the 45 minutes that a task-based fMRI takes. Once it is uploaded, they can rest easy. They don't really have to think about it. And they will get back the results of the various functional aspects of the brain within an hour. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how. So Dr. Arvind talked about how there are tasks how AI can help them scale. The fact that you've got, today he can look at 100, and AI, when it's trained on different doctors' way of looking, can do thousands of scans in lesser amount of time, and hence give him time to focus on the more creative aspects of his practice. That is one way of looking at AI. What we are doing is actually, this is This is automating things that radiologists today cannot do. And the difference, let me talk a little bit about that. So functional MRI, a resting state functional MRI particularly, is a 10-minute, extremely boring video of your brain. So you've got 10 minutes of a video, and these are 80 billion neurons activating. So the comparable is each of you has amount of traffic in your brain, which is equivalent to that of a Mumbai or a Delhi. And you all know how difficult and how populous these places are. So each of you have a Mumbai level amount of traffic in your brain. You're taking this 10-minute traffic map. And what you need to figure out is certain patterns in it, which will enable you to say that this is the language function, or be able to say that this is the default mode network. These roads together and these activations together make up the default mode network, or auditory network, or any of those networks. It's an impossible task for a human to do it today, which is why you only have in some of the best hospitals, you will have a team of PhDs who have figured out and who've got these really complicated data processing pipelines to be able to look at that traffic, take out all the noise. So they'll take out the blood noise, they'll take out the heart noise, the breathing noise, etc., to make the picture clear, to make the video clear. Once the video is clear, then actually looking at that one car possibly, which is going through one particular network and saying that this is the default mode network. And then actually comparing this to hundreds of Mumbai. So keep hundreds of Mumbai and Johannesburg and all of those and Glasgow, all of them together, which is equivalent to saying that I'm going to take 100 dementia patients and I'm going to see what are the patterns which are indicative of early signs of dementia. So looking at these 100 cities and saying that these are the kind of traffic jams that are possibly indicative of early signs of dementia, or these are the kind of traffic jams that are indicative of different types of psychosis. So even within psychosis, one of the things that has been seen in research right now is there are very different kinds of psychosis. There are very different kinds of traffic jams or activations, which can actually be brain-based markers for psychotic disorders. Or the fact that you can say that these are the different kinds of, in a multilingual person, these are the kind of language networks that are seen. Whereas for a single lingual person, these are the kind of activations that you can see. So essentially, that's the kind of work that needs to be done to be able to build these maps. And it's very difficult for any human to do it, to look at an 80 billion network and then kind of mark out that this is the thing. So what I call this the AI first kind of problem, as opposed to AI second. In an AI second problem, what you're able to do is you're essentially automating and helping a human perform a little bit better than without machines. While in an AI first kind of a problem, it is something that a human can't really do right now, and hence you are solving for that and giving them that information. So I would say that the field of neuroscience has in our product in VoxelBox, there is the part which is very AI first. You cannot even do it without AI and without machine learning methods. And there is the part which is about AI second. So I'll give you an example. For example, skull stripping. So when you look at a neuro image, one of the things that you need to do is to kind of strip out the skull, gory as it sounds. And the first time that Dr. Rimchim told me about it, I was like, oh my God, that just sounds really terrible. But skull stripping is a very difficult, painstaking exercise where you have to kind of keep putting dots and figuring out where the skull is. And it can go wrong. And it has a lot of implications on how you are looking at intensities in the brain. So one of the AI second problems that we solve in VoxelBox is we use a lot of existing images and the skull stripping of those to make that process more efficient. So our entire VoxelBox has a bunch of problems that we solve for using AI second techniques. And then there's the larger problem of how do you look for patterns. That is an AI first problem, which we then help doctors. We then give this information to doctors. So this is a summary of how what our work is really. So if you look at it, the first step is really taking these advanced imaging modalities like your DMRI, structural MRI, your resting state functional MRI. We take that and we then find out features in it which are structural, and we find a brain map, which is the functional part of it. We mine all of that data to find insights into neurological, psychiatric, and neurosurgical conditions. And then finally, because all of this is really mathematical, so if you actually look at the output of point number 3 here, it's just going to be a long list of brain areas that have been implicated by the AI. It's incredibly boring to read, and also incredibly, it's just incredibly complicated to read. So one of the things that we realized is that if you want to, like Microsoft Excel, if you want people to play around with it, you need to be able to give them interfaces that helps them, that maps to the way that they look at the world. And hence a lot of the AI outputs, what we are able to do is to kind of take that and map it back into the patient's brain space and show it back on the MRI space to the doctor, to the patient, etc. So it's all of this that is going into the building of this product. But for the doctor, the only thing that we kind of expect as a starting point is you can upload it and you'll get all of these results. Over time, what we do hope is as more doctors get interested in AI and machine learning and want to be more involved in the coding, etc., we do give those affordances as well. So like Microsoft Excel, you can do a lot of things with all the imaging data phenotypes if you prefer to, but if you don't, you can just get the final result, and that's all right too. And this is a broad summary of all of the features that we kind of, which I already did talk about. I would like to end the presentation about our work personally with a small video that one of our doctors, a surgeon, had. Are you able to hear, Darshika?
Will you increase the volume a little? Towards your right, there's.
Okay. Okay, let me just speak about it because I think it's not possible to increase the volume. So this was for a patient who had a glioma, and they weren't very sure if the patient's brain was left lateralized or right lateralized. And they asked us to do the resting state, and the patient was not cooperative. So essentially, they were not willing to go for the 45-minute task-based fMRI. So they did the 5-minute resting state fMRI, send us the data. We were able to figure out the various different functional networks. And for the language, we were able to figure out the laterality of the language function as a starting point. So the idea being that we give this as information to the doctor. In the absence of any other information, this is really useful information for the surgeon to think about it. In the presence, if the patient is willing to go for a task-based fMRI, this can be, as Dr. Arvind said, almost like a screening device, where you're saying that we believe that the language network is right lateralized, which is a very unusual thing. What we would like you to follow up on is to look at other tests that you could possibly do for this patient, which will enable you to make a much more confirmed diagnosis on whether this patient is right lateralized. So that's the way we are currently working with a lot of different hospitals where they are using our tool and on a for research use only basis to be able to give us feedback and to use this for their patients today. So that's where we are at today. Darshika, is there, that's one part of what I wanted to talk about, a little bit about our work and AI. But the second part of my presentation is really about the challenges of setting up a startup like this. And I'd be happy to jump over to that section.
Sure, definitely. Also, could we actually take this, post the questions, because we've been receiving a lot of questions. So, Dr. Singh, do you suggest we at least cover a couple of questions before we move to the challenges part of it? Because I think the questions also entail a lot of, queries about putting up a startup here as well.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, I think you can keep the screen share on, and I can just maybe cover a couple of questions before we move on to this. So, of course, I think the first question is from Dr. Samantha, who says, what is the future of artificial intelligence in the healthcare market? And I assume that that has been covered with you both speaking in details about it. So I'm moving on to my second question, which is, can artificial intelligence have any side effects in a patient-centric care? So, Dr. Singh, if you want to comment first.
I think, okay, I don't believe it has side effects as such. Often it might give you information that you don't want to receive, but all, as I said before, unlike Boeing 737 MAX, all our AI systems are advisory to the doctor. If you feel the additional information that it has given you is not in patient's best interest, then I think it's up to the clinician to decide the manner in which to share it. In other words, if it shows in one of Laina's advanced systems shows the patient has another 6 months to live,
correct,
the way a doctor handles it will depend upon, you can say, go out and have fun and don't spend all the money you have, or you can turn around and say, you've got to wind up your affairs and be prepared for it. But the way the AI and the information that AI gives is still up to the clinician to manage. So I don't think AI doesn't independently, just like Boeing 737 MAX, unlike Boeing 7, AI does not directly influence the patient. It doesn't execute anything. In other words, it doesn't automatically shut off the nutrition if it thinks the patient is getting excess of it. So that is the big advantage of AI.
Yeah, okay. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think artificial intelligence is not intelligent on its own. So I think a support of the human
and also it's been
required.
said that artificial intelligence is no substitute for natural stupidity. So if somebody wants to misuse that information, then artificial intelligence can't stop them from doing it.
Okay. I have another question from Dr. Jyotsna, who says, what are the main applications of natural language processing in healthcare? So, Dr. Laina, Ms. Laina, if you want to answer that, or else.
So we don't really work on natural language processing, as that's not the area that we work on. But I have seen a lot of interesting startups which are working in this space, where they're looking at how. So one of the very interesting examples that I've come across is where people are using voice markers and natural language processing to be able to look at early signs of dementia. And it has shown to have quite a high level of accuracy. So using that as a screening device has been, is something that is very prevalent, is an upcoming field right now. Apart from this, I'm not sure if you're also talking about textual interpretation. If textual interpretation is also a way that you're thinking about this right now, a lot of prescription automation, etc., that kind of work, very grunge work. There is a lot of work going on around how you can better recognize handwriting and then use that to collate a lot of information about the patient and make better decisions. So these are two things that I have seen, but I'm not the best person to answer this as well.
Okay, sure, no problem. Moving on to another question, which is from Dr. Ashok Puri. I think he says, could your model classify images from different makes of fundus cameras with equal accuracy of 90%? I think this is for Ms. Laina.
No, this is actually for Dr. Arvind.
Okay.
Yeah, the thing is, we are at this particular point in time, what we have done is a tight integration like Apple does of hardware and software. So we've designed the hardware to keep it low cost and the systems, but all the images that we have used for training our algorithm are taken on other devices. In fact, some of the images, because we don't have a system like our camera system in existence, all the images that we have used have been taken on 30,000-40,000 pound clinic cameras in clinics. So, and they are from different makes. We use Topcon, we use Zeiss, we use images from different devices. Whichever hospital I was working in, or my colleague William Whites was working in, we've used those images.
Question is, though it's a very direct question, but Dr. Terry wants to know which company has the best AI technology when it comes to health insurance, like among health insurance companies. So any comments from Dr. Singh?
I think we work in a system of National Health Service where we don't pay anything and don't get paid anything. So the insurance issue hasn't come in, but knowing the market as it does, we are confident that once our products are brought onto the market, just like Laina's products, each insurance company will decide on its own whether they need to reimburse for it. And I'm sure anything that saves human interaction is very attractive to insurance companies, because the maximum they have to pay out is for the time of the doctor.
Yeah, correct. Absolutely. Moving on to another question, I think both of you could sort of answer this. So, Dr. Elisa says, should the use of AI and technology be the new normal when it comes to medical education, health skill building, and communication?
I would say, so I do think that like IT became a part of curriculum for doctors and for various different other functionalities. I do think that AI will become one of those things that have to be included in the syllabus. Often I've heard, I think there's this one phrase I'd heard, AI is not ever going to replace doctors, but it'll replace doctors who don't use AI. And hence, you really need to, doctors really need to be able to work with these systems just so it can increase their own efficiency, so it can make their practice more beneficial to the patient, and it can make their own practice much more creative. They can really kind of focus on the more interesting problems that they come across and leave all the boring tasks to the AI and to the machine learning. So I do believe that this needs to be a part of the curriculum going forward. I also know that the NHS has brought out a 20-year plan, which kind of looks at how AI can be included in the curriculum. I was very impressed with that, and I hope that other countries also take that up.
I think technology is coming in a big way. I visited a good few years ago Mahatma Gandhi Medical College in Pondicherry, which is a brand new medical college. And it showed things that I hadn't even seen when I was studying. While anatomy dissection is going on a widescreen television, a three-dimensional atlas is available interactively. So before you cut anything on the body that you have in hand, you can actually do so on the screen virtually. So I'm sure that eventually most of the dissections will be replaced by virtual images. But more important, you can actually manipulate the images much better than you can manipulate your anatomical model. So just the way technology is coming in more and more into medical education, the use of AI at Mahatma Gandhi, all lectures are videoed and recorded. So if you miss a lecture for some reason, either because you had another course to attend or you were at a party or something, you can go back and replay the teacher's video. So the library, so every lecture given is recorded and available forever. So the technology is coming in a big way. I'm sure AI will also find its way in education.
Sure. Thank you so much. We have another question about startup in AI, so I'll just leave that for Dr. Laina to sort of discuss later. Another question from Dr. Satish Kumar, who says, what incentives India's healthcare workers have to use technological AI or ML-based models, as there are many IPC sections for diagnosis errors. Even during early days of COVID-19, many cases were filed against doctors for no mistakes of theirs?
I think culturally, until we get away from no blame culture as exists in Sweden and some other countries, the difficulty is a desperate relative of a patient. If a patient dies or suffers a problem, always looks for something to blame and to some extent get compensation. Now, medicine will never be 100% safe. I don't know a single surgical procedure which has zero complication rate.
Yeah.
So I think it's a question of educating the population that when a doctor goes to perform a procedure, he does it with the best of intentions and to help the patient. And if the procedure goes wrong, or if there's an unexpected complication, it is up to the clinician to explain to the patient the whole story and in truth. And I have found, I mean, as a retinal surgeon, I have come across patients whose vision could not be saved despite everything I did. Very complex, advanced diabetic damage. In some cases, even though I did everything right and the patient did everything right, the operation did not work. Now, in both cases, I've never come across a patient who has been annoyed or angry or vengeful. In fact, I have found it the other way around. There are patients on whom I've done 2 or 3 operations, and despite that, they have lost their vision. And when I've told them, look, I feel very bad, the patient has consoled me saying, doctor, I went to 3 other people, nobody would even touch me. At least you gave me a chance. So I think it's the way the communication occurs. And with this increasing workload everywhere, doctors find themselves with less and less time to explain to patients. Now in UK, with all this pandemic, the government expects family doctors to have 3-minute consultations. 3 minutes is about the time it takes for you to come into the office, sit down, adjust your clothes, get up and walk out. So I really don't think, but I think the communication is the key. If we want to look at the adverse events in surgery, just like adverse event anywhere else, it's the communication between doctor and the patient.
Rightly said. The next few questions are actually all about future possibilities of tackling tuberculosis through AI. Then there's also what can be done about breast cancers and how can AI help in accurate detection of breast cancers. Also another one for could it solve depression, anxiety, or stress? If yes, then how, especially for early detection of patients? So anything on that before we start with Dr. Laina?
Sure. I think there are some really interesting, I would actually say startups as well as researchers working on new methods for all the disorders that you mentioned. For TB, there are 2 different sets of people I know. One who's using a lot of mobile-based digital health solutions, so really kind of tuning themselves to the lifestyle of the patient to give them more specific advice in relation with their doctor. The second one is where they are using AI to look at better in the first 15 minutes itself, figuring out what drugs would work best for which patient. So there are a couple of startups working on those kind of problems. So that's on the TB space. I think there are some really interesting startups, and given that India has such a big problem of that, it is a space that is very ripe for innovation right now. Yeah. In the breast cancer space, I have seen a lot of startups which are working on, and some really interesting ones as well, which are working on breast cancer detection using imaging, and as giving that as an advice to the doctor. In depression, in the mental disorder space, I think one is you have the brain imaging markers as one of the most interesting, exciting developments that have come out of research and which are now being translated into clinical use by us. But there are others which are working on things like digital phenotyping. So really your mobile creating a social AI. So being able to use the inputs by the caregiver and by the patient to develop an AI which can inform the doctor much better about what is going on with the patient. As Dr. Arvind said, you might get 3 minutes, 7 minutes. In India, I think the average time that a psychiatrist or a psychologist gets with a patient is 7 minutes. And in that 7 minutes, actually telling the figuring out, and because it's very subjective and lots of questions that you need to ask the patient, asking all those questions, specifying the patient and their family, helping them understand the diagnosis, all of that needs to take place in a very short time. So there are ways in which the digital phenotyping can be an adjunct to the doctor, so that 7 minutes can be much better utilized. So I wouldn't say that it can solve depression, but I do think that it can make the life of the doctor and the patient much easier.
Just 2 points I'd like to make. As far as the treatment is concerned, diagnosis, the personalized medicine is coming in a big way. Yesterday on the radio, I was listening to if you have breast cancer or the different types of breast cancer, for a whole lot of different reasons, the cells start multiplying the way they do. And now with the help of AI, people are discovering drugs or creating drugs that would specifically reverse that process or address that process. So you can have different versions of the same cancer being treated in different patients with appropriate drugs. So drug design is end-to-end drug design, as it's called, is a very prevalent field for AI to be applied in. And it's coming. Secondly, when Laina and I had a discussion just after they had founded the company as to what kind of things they should look at, what we both agreed on is it's useful to look at conditions which can either be treated, modified, or prepared for. Like if you diagnose Alzheimer's or depression, you can actually prepare the treatment pathway in a way that benefits the individual as well as society. So I think their focus, fortunately, is entirely, they are not doing any blue sky research saying, let's see if this person can do this, that, and the other with a scan. But they are using their scans to either guide treatment or predict the outcome of the condition. I think that is the most useful use of AI I've come across.
I'm again very, very sorry, but I've got 2 more questions. Sorry, Ms. Laina, to make you wait.
No, I think that's great. I think the questions are far more exciting than anything I have to say. So yes.
Okay. So Dr. Ashok Puri has a follow-up question to the one about the fundus camera. So he says, suppose the model was trained with images from only one fundus camera, would the accuracy have been even better?
No. One of the reasons that we find AI very useful is you can feed a lot of information into it. And that information is then collectively processed. So if we choose, or when we've got a patent, we will allow licensing of the device separate from the algorithms. And we have set up a separate company to use the licensing procedure. So once our patent comes through, hopefully in the next month, we will address and market and make available both solutions separately or together. So you could choose the AI algorithm which is customized to the device that you're using. Our AI experts are reasonably confident in the end, it will be device agnostic at manufacture, but when it's being put in place for you, it will be adjusted to your camera. And it's far easier to do an algorithm for an expensive clinic camera than it is for a handheld low-cost camera.
Indeed, yes, may I add something to it, Dr. Arvind? So, in fact, in our case, we work with a variety of machines. So there are MRIs taken from Siemens, from Philips, from GE. And what we do is we always, once you've got the base model, then we work with 10, 15 from a new machine to see how well it is working on that. And what we've seen so far is that it really kind of matches up. And where not, we include that training data set also, and we bring out the next version of the algorithm. So it's machine agnostic to a great extent based on all the trainings that we've done on different machines so far. However, as and when it happens, where it's not, we include that.
It's customizable for the machine.
Indeed, indeed.
Okay. Sure. One more question. This is from Dr. Raj Halimani, who says, do you think one can subtype neuropsychiatric disorders using AI?
Yes, indeed. In fact, one of the very interesting work that is being done and which we ourselves are also doing, it's being done in research as well as we are also working on it, is on subtyping of various different types of disorders. So what has been seen is that neuropsychiatric disorders are really based on a lot of subjective questions and these scales, which don't really directly correlate to brain-based markers. And there is a translation language that you need between the two. And that AI is actually able to kind of build that, because if you give the AI a bunch of brain images relating to schizophrenia patients and you ask it to do unsupervised learning, what it is able to do is actually find out very distinct biotypes of brain images, and hence which can be very useful for the drug design that Dr. Arvind talked about. So, yes.
Thank you so much. Now, I think we'll move towards Ms. Laina's next part of the presentation. Ma'am, I would like to request you to actually focus, of course, on the challenges that are involved in a successful implementation and putting up such unit, but also talk about, there's another question because from Dr. Meera, who says, how do I start a new startup in AI for healthcare? What open source technologies would be useful for this purpose as well? So if you could also answer that.
So let me actually start with answering Dr. Meera's question, because I think that'll give, I think I mentioned the challenges which I've mentioned are a little bit more deeply technical, and then it goes on to business. So I'm going to flip that around a little bit. So when you start a company in AI, there are two, I think the way to think about any company, not just an AI company, there are three phases to it. And let me actually skip directly to it, which is an idea stage. One of the biggest challenges here at this point is how do you work on something that you already have credibility for. So the healthcare in general is a very regulated field. It is a very, it's highly regulated. It runs on credibility. You need to be able to, from the get-go, say that this is something that you know about. So if it is a space that you are really comfortable with, and then you look at problems within that area to solve, I think half the battle is won. So that's at the very ideation stage. The second big stage in which you will have a lot of problems is when you have to find the first 10 customers. Finding the first 10 customers is like a cold start problem. I don't know. I was born and brought up in Delhi. And in Delhi, when it got really cold, the car wouldn't start. And so you really had to kind of cold start it and like do a lot of things before it started. And I think any startup goes through that cold start problem, and finding those first 10 customers who really believe in your work, who really believe in the algorithm that you're developing is going to be a challenge. Now, when you do this, what I would highly recommend, Dr. Meera, is to look at a thing called the 24 steps of disciplined entrepreneurship. The reason why I say that is it really gives you a framework. A lot of entrepreneurs, people who are starting out companies, forget that you have to do a lot of pivoting. Your first idea might not be great. Your third idea, your fourth idea, your fifth idea might be the one which actually clicks with your customers. So a lot of people tend to forget about that, or they tend to forget that as you're pivoting, you might be slowly pivoting towards something which is so specialized that you are never going to be able to justify the cost of making it. There are all of these various different questions that you need to think about. And what I would urge you when you are starting out a company in the AI healthcare space, to really kind of put these big picture questions in front of you. And every time you go to a customer, every time you go to somebody who's even vaguely interested in your idea, to validate your assumptions. I think that's one of the key things. And so one thing is you might get very embarrassed in the beginning. I got really embarrassed because every time I would go to somebody and they would be like, this doesn't work for me, and I'll have to come back and go back to the drawing board. But having these big picture questions in front of me always really helped. And I would be happy to send you across the format for those if you're ever thinking of starting off anytime soon. So that is the next big barrier that you will have to kind of go through when you're starting your company. And the third big thing third big phase that you really need to be working on is how do you build, which is building for the, understanding what the customer wants is one big part of the problem. Building a company to be able to service that is a whole different problem. So you are actually designing the product and you're designing an organization at the same time, which means that you need to be able to take everything that the doctor says and translate that into a technical requirement. You need to be able to talk the language of the technical people. In our case, I need to be able to talk the language of the neuroimaging people in my team, the neuroscience people in my team, the machine learning, and the software people in my team. And it's a lot of work. And I think what you need to be, Dr. Meera, is somebody who can translate across all of these various different languages. And what really helps me there is an absolute focus on the customer, which is that always going back to the customer and saying, would you like this? No matter how bad I'm at translation within my team, if the customer says yes, for the customer, it's very easy. They'll say, this is of no use to me, or this is of great use to me. Coming back and saying that to the team, and the translation, whatever it might be, everybody understands that language. So I think that piece is the third big piece. I think just the first two stages are where a lot of people flounder. And I would really urge you to kind of be very disciplined and very customer oriented in those first two phases. And the reason I say this is I have seen a lot of people who first build a product. They say that, oh, hey, I've got so many years of experience in this space and I will build this product and people will come. And it doesn't happen that way. It invariably fails because you haven't thought of so many other questions. It's very unlikely that your first idea will work. So I would strongly urge you to kind of think about this. So that's the first big challenge. And I think in the first 3 years of our startup, I'm still working with these problems as we go. So yeah, that's there. The second, I think in terms of AI, I think if you're looking at AI specific problems, right, there are some things which I've written which are very, very key when you're thinking of AI specific companies. I'll take my brain example as an example all throughout. The first big problem is that in AI, there are a lot of data variables that can come in. So the key to making a good AI is to ignoring the right details or ignoring a lot of details and focusing on only the most important ones. So in fact, as Dr. Arvind had mentioned, that there was this one, the distance between the macular, and I'm not getting the thing right, but that was the one thing that really worked for the customer. That was the one thing that they thought was a really big problem, and hence they only focused on that, rather than focusing on all the 100 other different things that they could focus on. AI, because there is so much data, because the data itself has so many nuances, it's very easy to get lost in a lot of nuances. So I think one of the first things that you need to kind of focus on when building an AI company is learning the fine art of ignoring a lot of details. And I think here, just to give you an example, we had to figure out what imaging modalities to ignore. So we could have worked on SMRI, FNIRS, we could have worked on DMRI, etc. But we really, in the beginning, had to be very focused on, we're going to start with structural MRI, then we're going to start with resting state, and then we're going to start with DMRI. We are not going to lose focus because 5 people came and told us that, hey, you should also work on FNIRS. So I think that level of focus was very, very needed. The second big problem that an AI company has to focus on, like when you've got, in our case, when you've got the brain image and you've ignored all the correct details, all the incorrect details, and only focused on a very small subset of it, what are you going to what are you going to really infer from it? And I think that needs to come from conversations with your customers, with doctors. So every time, because the same image data set, you can slice and dice in so many different ways that what the doctor wants might not be the one which your team is focusing on. So really kind of focusing on, here are the 5 things that a doctor wants, and you will go backwards from that and figure out what algorithm you want to build, how you want to slice and dice your data. That customer orientation, again, is a very, very important part of that. The third big problem that you're going to face when you are building an AI company is, at least this is our case, I don't know if it works in other organs as well. In the brain, you have so many different ways in which you can look at the same data. So even if you've ignored the right details, even if you have only focused on what the customer has said, let's say the customer has told us that they want to learn about language lateralization, and hence we only are going to focus on language lateralization and nothing else. Even then, there are so many different ways in which clinicians look at language lateralization. So how do you kind of put all of this in a modular way so that the doctor can play around with it? If you remember what I said, we want to make the Microsoft Excel so that the doctor doesn't feel like the power is taken away from them. The power needs to be back with them so they can enjoy their practice. So, which means that you need to be able to build these building blocks in ways that can be reconfigured at any point of time. And that's going to be a big challenge about how do you make it modular. And I'll be happy to talk about that, but I do think that that's very specific to our work. Now, the other big problem that I want to talk about, which I think every AI company will face, is that there is an explosion of data that is coming out. Now, as you have more data, your accuracy obviously improves. However, the computational complexity also improves a lot. It drastically increases. So the computational complexity of working with 1,000 data sets is very different from the computational complexity of working with 10,000 data sets. And what you need to be able to kind of think a little bit into the future is, how are you going to scale? Are you going to build your platform as a service, which you can, as a software as a service is a very big thing. So are you going to build a service where people can upload and then you can just send it back? How are you going to build this high performance computing when it's all with you? It's very easy. You can scale it to 5 GPUs, you can scale it to 10 GPUs, you can scale it to 15 GPUs. But if you're making it as a on hospital premise, you're giving this to doctors, what that means is you need to be able to think of the computational complexity that will come to the doctor and hence plan for that. This is going to be a big problem as you go forward and keep getting more data. The third big thing that I think everybody should focus on is this challenge of using explainable AI. I think this is a very big thing. A lot of people focus on deep learning methods, which is great. But what it means is that at the end of when you're giving the report to the doctor doesn't know why the AI is saying what it is saying. Like you've got, I remember this one case where I think somebody was working on pathology reports and there was this one slide on which ink had been dropped and that was used in the training. And because that was used in the training, all the pathology reports were quite wrong. And hence and they could never figure it out because the AI could not be traced backwards. And what you then need to think about is, how are you going to make this explainable for the doctors that you work with? I think these are some of the big pieces that I wanted to talk about. I think I've already talked about the big building a market piece. And I just want to kind of end with saying that building a startup is like building an airplane while it is flying. I think you are removing the tire, replacing the tire, doing all of these things while you're up in the air. And it's very complicated. It's fun, but it's also a lot of fun. And so whoever is thinking of starting, a big best of luck and happy to help in it anyway. So thank you, Darshika.
Thank you so much, Ms. Laina. I think once somebody actually works in the field, especially practically making making a living out of it, I do understand that there are challenges which you only must be aware of, and hence I think it was a very valuable input that you shared with us. So I think these are all the questions we had. So I would like to close this session for today. And if we receive more questions from the audience, I'll definitely reach out to both of you. So thank you so much, Dr. Singh and Ms. Laina. It was lovely having you both here. Very, very valuable inputs from both of you. And I'll looking forward to more such sessions in the coming months.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Darshika, for having us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Have
Dr.
a good
Arvind.
day. Yeah.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Recording stopped.